Our first lesson of photosynthesis is really going to be about talking about the basics of information before we get into the actual process. And since we understand that photosynthesis is all about taking a non-usable form of energy in the sun and converting it into a more stored, usable form in glucose, which is chemical energy, to eventually break it down into ATP, I thought it'd be good to kind of start at the end and say this is what our whole goal is to make this molecule. It's adenosine triphosphate, known as ATP. And over here on the right is a basic structural diagram of it. It actually is very similar to that of a nucleotide. If you remember, a nucleotide from DNA had a sugar central molecule. It had only one phosphate group, but it also had a nitrogen base. It had 4 varieties, but here ATP has adenine. Adenine, which is the same nitrogen base, ribose, which is the sugar found in an RNA nucleotide, but instead of having 1 phosphate group, it has 3. So please don't get them confused if there is an option and the question asks which of these molecules is used for energy within an organism. You've got to look for just 3 phosphates there. So that is just a very simplified diagram of an ATP. And sometimes they oversimplify it, as we've seen in some animations, where they have the 3 structures of the phosphates, but then they'll consolidate this into potentially just an abbreviated, and it says the A, like A on it, to represent the adenine and ribose together. Over here is just the life cycle, you could say, of ATP. And when ATP is used, what will happen is this second and third phosphate on the outside, this bond will break, and the energy is used and released to the system. The amount of stored energy required in ADP is not as much as ATP. So therefore, you can think of this as an exothermic reaction, where the reactant of ATP has more stored energy than that of its product. So therefore, the difference between where it starts and where it ends is released. That's the whole purpose and idea of an exothermic reaction. I sometimes think about the idea that when you're using energy, think of something very strenuous where you're using muscles and using a lot of energy. Think of your body heating up because you're transforming all this ATP and using it for energy. So now the form or final product is ADP. Doesn't need as much energy, so therefore all that energy has been released and you kind of feel all that heat. ADP is very much able to absorb energy from an outside source and rejuvenate to form ATP. So this is like a cycle. It just goes around and around. As long as you have energy to absorb later on, you can then recharge this ADP back into ATP. So it's more of an endothermic reaction. We start with a low energy molecule. We end with a high energy molecule. So where does the difference of that energy come from? It's got to be absorbed from the outside. So they kind of compare it, and you're going to see this is just a picture. They kind of compare it to a flashlight / rechargeable battery. So the one on the left here is ATP. It has a lot more energy. It can kind of shine a little bit further. I think that was their indication if you see textbooks. ADP still is going to have a little bit of energy, but not as much. So the ability of a rechargeable battery is that I can turn this back into a full charge. And that's where what I just explained. As long as you have the energy for an endothermic reaction to take place, this ADP will join with another phosphate and return back to ATP, so it can be used again. These two terms, heterotroph and autotroph, are the reason why we talk about photosynthesis, because organisms that are classified as heterotrophs are organisms that must obtain food or nutrients from an outside source. So I've got to slide this over. I probably can't see that yet. So they obtain food or nutrients from an outside source in order to create ATP. That food that we obtain is like glucose. So we have an outside source, our glucose, because we can't make it from non-usable forms. So we take the glucose in and we create ATP from it. That happens at the mitochondria, but chloroplasts and photosynthesis and cell respiration, they're so intertwined, it's important to kind of know where we're going with this. We are heterotrophs, so classify any animal as a heterotroph. Autotroph is an organism that can convert energy into a stored form, really convert non-usable energy, such as sunlight. That's in an intro class, 99% of the time you're talking about photosynthetic autotrophs. They can take sunlight and convert it into a stored form, which is glucose. When the autotroph would need the glucose out of the stored form, they break it down at their mitochondria to create its own energy. So I put create in quotes because they're not really creating energy. All they have the ability to do is one step before the heterotroph. They can take non-usable energy and convert it into a stored form. Auto, if you know other words such as automatic, autonomous, that means self, and things drive themselves. And autotrophs are things that are self-sufficient. They can take energy from another source and eventually make it into what they really need. So we then enter into really the basics of photosynthesis. Zoom this out. So light is the first thing we talk about, and light comes in different wavelengths, and that's how it travels. Wavelength, if you can imagine a wave, the crest to crest of a wave is its wavelength, the distance between crest to crest. And the colors of light, which you have memorized from the time you were such a small child, Roy G. Biv, each different color has a different wavelength, which we're going to look at in a few minutes. The light that travels, there is no atomic structure for light. It's a source of energy. Light travels in packages of energy known as photons. So those photons are not traveling in a straight line from sun to this planet. Instead, they are traveling in waves. And when a photon strikes an object, one of three things can happen. It can be absorbed, reflected, or transmitted. If we're looking at photosynthesis, this is really what we want to happen. We want the light to be absorbed. That's what autotrophs can do. They can take the absorbed sunlight and transfer it into usable energy. Light that is reflected or light that is transmitted is wasted energy. It's great for color, so you can see color. That's why we see the colors that we see, because light is being reflected as well. If everything got absorbed, then everything would appear black. Not all chemicals have the ability to absorb light. Things such as your hair, so think of your hair, your skin, your clothes, they all contain pigments. And a pigment is just a chemical or molecule that can absorb photons of light. They can also reflect those light, and that's why we see the different colors that we see, because of pigments in them. One specific pigment that we're going to talk about is chlorophyll, and that's the photosynthetic pigment, so that's why we're really going to talk about it. There are other pigments. We've learned that pigments are found in plant organelles known as plastids. A chloroplast is one particular one that holds chlorophyll. Chromoplasts hold the other colors like oranges and reds, and they have specific names that we don't ever really go into the details of for an intro class. But getting back to light and why all this is important, since light travels in waves, there's a variation between all the different colors. So I'm going to show you a little graph that has the different wavelengths of light. Find it here. Sorry. Here it is. So there's our graph. This is a graph of chlorophyll, and there is technically two types of chlorophyll, but if you look, they both have a very generic, similar shape. They kind of go up here, down, flat, and then there's another peak. We think of it just as chlorophyll, so I'm not going to differentiate between chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. But here is your x-axis, its wavelengths. It does say in angstroms. Most times I actually see wavelengths in nanometers. It's still the same scale from 4,000 to 7,000. And here we're looking at the percentage of light that can be absorbed. So for chlorophyll, we notice that at the blue to violet range, it is very good at absorbing those colors. That's why it goes up. It's pretty bad at absorbing greens and yellows. That should somewhat make sense, because when sunlight shines onto a plant, we see it as green. Because it's not absorbing the green, it's reflecting it back, so our eyes can see all those wavelengths back. In terms of wavelength, we can see that violet has 4,000 or near 4,000, and red has near 7,000. So when you memorize your Roy G. Biv, it actually is in reverse order. You're memorizing them in the longest wavelength to shortest wavelength. It's important because it also, the length of the wave indicates how much energy it holds. The way you determine the amount of energy one photon of each light holds is based on its inverse of its wavelength. So 1 over 4,000 compared to 1 over 7,000, if I look at the two extreme colors. 1 over 4,000 is a larger value than 1 over 7,000. So 1 photon of violet is actually more energy than 1 photon of red. And that is important to know. So Roy G. Biv is actually in descending energy potential. Violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, red, and I'm sure you're aware that indigo is not a color, but this is just kind of talking about how this scale shows us that it's increasing in this way for wavelength, and it's increasing in terms of its potential energy. So not only does it absorb violet and blue very well, it's also absorbing the most powerful of the photons, which is also good. Okay? If we had a sun that wasn't all the colors of the visible spectrum here, if we had a sun that was only green, we actually wouldn't survive very long, or plants wouldn't survive very long, because all of that sun would be wasted, being reflected right back. No energy would be placed into our ecosystem. So that kind of covers a lot of the basic stuff about photosynthesis. Our next topic will really dive into the first part of photosynthesis.